Section 7 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. All About Coffee by William Ukers. Chapter 6. The Introduction of Coffee into England. The first printed reference to coffee in English. Early mention of coffee by noted English travelers and writers. The Lacedaemonian black broth controversy. How Canopios introduced coffee drinking at Oxford. The first English coffee house in Oxford. Two English botanists on coffee. English travelers and writers of the 16th and 17th centuries were quite as enterprising as their continental contemporaries in telling about the coffee bean and the coffee drink. The first printed reference to coffee in English, however, appears as Chaoyua in a note by a Dutchman, Paludanus, in Linschotten's Travels, the title of an English translation from the Latin of a work first published in Holland in 1595 or 1596, the English edition appearing in London in 1598. A reproduction made from a photograph of the original work with the quaint black-letter German text and the Paludanus notation in Roman is shown herewith. Hans Hugo, or John Huygen, van Linschoten, 1563 through 1611, was one of the most intrepid of Dutch travelers. In his description of Japanese manners and customs, we find one of the earliest tea references. He says, "Their manner of eating and drinking is, every man hath a table alone, without tablecloths or napkins, and eateth with two pieces of wood like the men of Chino. They drink wine of rice, wherewith they drink themselves drunk, and after their meat they use a certain drink, which is a pot with hot water, which they drink as hot as ever they may endure, whether it be winter or summer." Just here, Bernard ten Broek Paludanus, 1550 through 1633, Dutch savant and author, professor of philosophy at the University of Leiden, himself a traveler over the four quarters of the globe, inserts his note containing the coffee reference. He says, "The Turks hold almost the same manner of drinking of their chaona, which they make of certain fruit, which is like unto the bacalaire, and by the Egyptians called bon or ban. They take of this fruit 1 pound and a half, and roast them a little in the fire, and then seeth them in 20 pounds of water, till the half be consumed away. This drink they take every morning fasting in their chambers, out of an earthen pot, being very hot, as we do here drink aqua composita in the morning, and they say that it strengtheneth and maketh them warm, breaketh wind, and openeth any stopping." Van Linschoten then completes his tea reference by saying, "The manner of dressing their meat is altogether contrary unto other nations. The aforesaid warm water is made with the powder of a certain herb called cha, which is much esteemed and is well accounted among them." The cha is, of course, tea, dialect te. In 1599, Sir Anthony, or Anthony, Shirley, 1565 through 1630, a picturesque gentleman adventurer, the first Englishman to mention coffee drinking in the Orient, sailed from Venice on a kind of self-appointed, informal Persian mission to invite the Shah to ally himself with the Christian princes against the Turks, and incidentally to promote English trade interests in the East. The English government knew nothing of the arrangement, disavowed him, and forbade his return to England. However, the expedition got to Persia, and the account of the voyage thither was written by William Parry, one of the Shirley party, and was published in London in 1601. It is interesting because it contains the first printed reference to coffee in English employing the more modern form of the word. The original reference was photographed for this work in the Worth Library of the British Museum and is reproduced herewith on page 39. The passage is part of an account of the manners and customs of the Turks, who, Parry says, are damned infidels, in Aleppo. It reads, "They sit at their meat, which is served to them upon the ground, as tailors sit upon their stalls, cross-legged, for the most part passing the day in banqueting and carousing until they surfeit, drinking a certain liquor which they do call coffee, which is made of seed much like mustard seed, which will soon intoxicate the brain like our metheglin. Another early English reference to coffee, wherein the word is spelled kofa, is in Captain John Smith's book of Travels and Adventure, published in 1603. He says of the Turks, "Their best drink is kofa, of a grain they call koava." This is the same Captain John Smith who, in 1607, became the founder of the colony of Virginia and brought with him to America probably the earliest knowledge of the beverage given to the new Western world. Samuel Purchas, 1527 through 1626, an early English collector of travels, in Purchas His Pilgrims, under the head of Observations of William Finch, Merchant, at Socotra, an island in the Indian Ocean, in 1607, says of the Arab inhabitants, "Their best entertainment is a china dish of coho, a black, bitterish drink, made of a berry like a bayberry, brought from Mecca, supped off hot, good for the head and stomach." Still other early and favorite English references to coffee are those to be found in the Travels of William Biddulph. This work was published in 1609. It is entitled The Travels of Certain Englishmen in Africa, Asia, etc., begun in 1600 and by some of them finished this year, 1608. These references are also reproduced herewith from the black letter originals in the British Museum. Biddulph's description of the drink and of the coffee house customs of the Turks was the first detailed account to be written by an Englishman. It also appears in Purchas His Pilgrims, 1625. But, to quote, "Their most common drink is kofa, which is a black kind of drink, made of a kind of pulse like peas, called koawa, which being ground in the mill and boiled in water, they drink it as hot as they can suffer it, which they find to agree very well with them against their crudities, and feeding on herbs and raw meats. Other compounded drinks they have, called sherbet, made of water and sugar, or honey, with snow therein to make it cool. For although the country be hot, yet they keep snow all the year long to cool their drink. It is accounted a great courtesy amongst them to give unto their friends when they come to visit them, a finian or scudella of kaffa, which is more wholesome than toothsome, for it causeth good concoction, and driveth away drowsiness. Some of them also drink birch or opium, which maketh them forget themselves, and talk idly of castles in the air, as though they saw visions and heard revelations. Their kofa houses are more common than ale houses in England, but they use not so much to sit in the houses as on benches on both sides of the streets. Ne'er unto a kofa house every man with his finian full, which being smoking hot, they use to put it to their noses and ears, and then sup it off by leisure, being full of idle and alehouse talk whiles they are amongst themselves drinking it. If there be any news, it is talked of there. Among other early English references to coffee, we find an interesting one by Sir George Sandys, 1577 through 1644, the poet who gave a start to classical scholarship in America by translating Ovid's Metamorphoses during his pioneer days in Virginia. In 1610, he spent a year in Turkey, Egypt, and Palestine, and records of the Turks, "Although they be destitute of taverns, yet have they their kofa houses, which something resemble them. There sit they chatting most of the day, and sip of a drink called kofa, of the berry that it is made of, in little china dishes as hot as they can suffer it, black as soot, and tasting not much unlike it. Why not that black broth which was in use amongst the Lacedaemonians, which helpeth, as they say, digestion, and procureth alacrity, many of the kofa men keeping beautiful boys who serve as stales to procure them customers." Edward Terry, 1590 through 1660, an English traveler, writes under date of 1616 that many of the best people in India who are strict in their religion and drink no wine at all use a liquor more wholesome than pleasant, they call coffee, made by a black seed boiled in water, which turns it almost into the same color, but doth very little alter the taste of the water. Notwithstanding, it is very good to help digestion, to quicken the spirits, and to cleanse the blood. In 1623, Francis Bacon, 1561 through 1626, in his Historia Vitae et Mortis, says, "The Turks use a kind of herb, which they call café," and in 1624, in his Silva Savarum, published in 1627 after his death, he writes, "They have in Turkey a drink called kofa, made of a berry of the same name, as black as soot, and of a strong scent, but not aromatical, which they take, beaten into powder, in water, as hot as they can drink it. And they take it and sit at in their coffee houses, which are like our taverns. This drink comforteth the brain and heart, and helpeth digestion. Certainly this berry kofa, the root and leaf beetle, and leaf tobacco, and the tare of poppy, opium, of which the Turks are great talkers, supposing it expelleth all fear, do all condense the spirits, and make them strong and alleger. But it seemeth they were taken after several manners, for kofa and opium are taken down, tobacco but in smoke, and betel is but champed in the mouth with a little lime." Robert Burton, 1577 through 1640, English philosopher and humorist, in his Anatomy of Melancholy, writes in 1632, "The Turks have a drink called kofa, for they use no wine, so named of a berry as black as soot and as bitter, like that black drink which was in use amongst the Lacedaemonians, and perhaps the same, which they sip still of, and sup as warm as they can suffer. They spend much time in those kofa houses, which are somewhat like our ale houses or taverns, and there they sit, chatting and drinking, to drive away the time, and to be merry together, because they find, by experience, that kind of drink so used helpeth digestion and procureth alacrity." Later English scholars, however, found sufficient evidence in the works of Arabian authors to assure their readers that coffee sometimes breeds melancholy, causes headache, and maketh lean much. One of these, Dr. Pocock, 1659, see Chapter 3, stated that "he that would drink it for liveliness' sake, and to discuss slothfulness, let him use much sweet meats with it, and oil of pistachios, and butter. Some drink it with milk, but it is an error, and such as may bring in danger of the leprosy." Another writer observed that any ill effects caused by coffee, unlike those of tea, etc., ceased when its use was discontinued. In this connection, it is interesting to note that in 1785, Dr. Benjamin Moseley, physician to the Chelsea Hospital, member of the College of Physicians, etc., probably having in mind the popular idea that the Arabic original of the word coffee meant force or vigor, once expressed the hope that the coffee drink might return to popular favor in England as a cheap substitute for those enervating teas and beverages which produce the pernicious habit of dram drinking. About 1628, Sir Thomas Herbert, 1606 through 1681, English traveler and writer, records among his observations on the Persians that "they drink above all the rest koho or kofa, by Turk and Arab called café and kahua, a drink imitating that in the Stygian lake, black, thick, and bitter, distrained from bunchi, bunu, or bayberries. Wholesome, they say, if hot, for it expels melancholy, but not so much regarded for those good properties as from a romance that it was invented and brewed by Gabriel to restore the decayed radical moisture of kind-hearted Mahomet." In 1634, Sir Henry Blount, 1602 through 1682, sometimes referred to as the father of the English coffee house, made a journey on a Venetian galley into the Levant. He was invited to drink café in the presence of Amurath IV, and later in Egypt he tells of being served the beverage again in a porcelain dish. This is how he describes the drink in Turkey. "They have another drink not good at meat, called kaufe, made of a berry as big as a small bean, dried in a furnace and beat to powder, of a soot color, in taste a little bitterish, that they seethe and drink as hot as may be endured. It is good all hours of the day, but especially morning and evening, when, to that purpose, they entertain themselves 2 or 3 hours in café houses, which in all Turkey abound more than inns and alehouses with us. It is thought to be the old black broth used so much by the Lacedaemonians, and drieth ill humours in the stomach, comforteth the brain, never causeth drunkenness or any other surfeit, and is a harmless entertainment of good fellowship. For there upon scaffolds half a yard high, and covered with mats, they sit cross-legged, after the Turkish manner, many times 200 or 300 together, talking, and likely with some poor music passing up and down. This reference to the Lacedaemonians' black broth, first by Sandys, then by Burton, again by Blount, and concurred by James Howell, 1595 through 1666, the first historiographer royal, gave rise to considerable controversy among English men of letters in later years. It is, of course, a gratuitous speculation. The black broth of the Lacedaemonians was pork cooked in blood and seasoned with salt and vinegar. William Harvey, 1578 through 1657, the famous English physician who discovered the circulation of the blood, and his brother are reputed to have used coffee before coffee houses came into vogue in London. This must have been previous to 1652. I remember, says Aubrey, he was wont to drink coffee, which his brother Eliab did, before coffee houses were the fashion in London. Houghton, in 1701, speaks of the famous inventor of the circulation of the blood, Dr. Harvey, who some say did frequently use it. Although it seems likely that coffee must have been introduced into England sometime during the first quarter of the 17th century, with so many writers and travelers describing it, and with so much trading going on between the merchants of the British Isles and the Orient, yet the first reliable record we have of its advent is to be found in the diary and correspondence of John Evelyn, F.R.S., under Notes of 1637, where he says, "There came in my time to the college, Balliol, Oxford, one Nathaniel Conopios, out of Greece, from Cyril, the patriarch of Constantinople, who, returning many years after, was made, as I understand it, Bishop of Smyrna. He was the first I ever saw drink coffee, which custom came not into England till 30 years thereafter." Evelyn should have said 13 years after, for then it was that the first coffee house was opened, 1650. Conopius was a native of Crete, trained in the Greek Church. He became primore to Cyril, Patriarch of Constantinople. When Cyril was strangled by the vizier, Conopius fled to England to avoid a like barbarity. He came with credentials to Archbishop Laud, who allowed him maintenance in Balliol College. It was observed that while he continued in Balliol College, he made the drink for his own use called coffee, and usually drank it every morning, being the first, as the ancients of that house have informed me, that was ever drank in Oxon. In 1640, John Parkinson, 1567 through 1650, English botanist and herbalist, published his Theatrum Botanicum, containing the first botanical description of the coffee plant in English, referred to as Arbor bon cumsua buna, the Turk's berry drink. His work being somewhat rare, it may be of historical interest to quote the quaint description here. Alpinus, in his Book of Egyptian Plants, giveth us a description of this tree, which, as he saith, he saw in the garden of a certain captain of the Ianissaries, which was brought out of Arabia Felix and there planted as a rarity, never seen growing in those places before. The tree, saith Alpinus, is somewhat like unto the Evonimus prick-timber tree, whose leaves were thicker, harder, and greener, and always abiding green on the tree. The fruit is called buna, and is somewhat bigger than an hazelnut, and longer, round also, and pointed at the end, furrowed also on both sides, yet on one side more conspicuous than the other, that it might be parted in two, in each side whereof lieth a small long white kernel. Flat on that side they join together, covered with a yellowish skin, of an acid taste, and somewhat bitter withal, and contained in a thin shell, of a darkish ash color, which these berries generally in Arabia and Egypt and in other places of the Turks' dominions, they make a decoction or drink, which is in the stead of wine to them, and generally sold in all their tap houses, called by the name of coava. Paludanus saith chaova, and Ralvophus chaube. This drink hath many good physical properties therein, for it strengthened a weak stomach, helpeth digestion, and the tumours and obstructions of the liver and spleen, being drunk fasting for some time together. In 1650, a certain Jew from Lebanon, in some accounts Jacob or Jacobs by name, in others Jobson, opened at the Angel in the parish of St. Peter in the East, Oxford, the earliest English coffee houses, and there it, coffee, was by some who delighted in novelty, drank. Chocolate was also sold at this first coffee house. Authorities differ, but the confusion as to the name of the coffee house keeper may have arisen from the fact that there were two Jacobs who began in 1650, and another, Cirque Jobson, a Jewish Jacobite, who followed him in 1654. The drink at once attained great favor among the students. Soon it was in such demand that about 1655 a society of young students encouraged one Arthur Tilliard, apothecary and royalist, to sell coffee publicly in his house against all Souls College. It appears that a club composed of admirers of the young Charles met at Tilliard's and continued until after the Restoration. This Oxford Coffee Club was the start of the Royal Society. Jacobs removed to Old Southampton Buildings, London, where he was in 1671. Meanwhile, the first coffee house in London had been opened by Pasquale Rosé in 1652, and as the remainder of the story of coffee's rise and fall in England centers around the coffee houses of Old London, we shall reserve it for a separate chapter. Of course, the coffee house idea and the use of coffee in the home quickly spread to other cities in Great Britain. But all the coffee houses were patterned after the London model. Moll's Coffee House at Exeter, Devonshire, which is pictured on page 41, was one of the first coffee houses established in England and may be regarded as typical of those that sprang up in the provinces. It had previously been a noted clubhouse, and the old hall, beautifully paneled with oak, still displays the arms of noted members. Here Sir Walter Raleigh and congenial friends regaled themselves with smoking tobacco. This was one of the first places where tobacco was smoked in England. It is now an art gallery. When the Bishop of Beirut, Beirut, was on his way to Cochin, China in 1666, he reported that the Turks used coffee to correct the indisposition caused in the stomach by the bad water. This drink, he says, imitates the effect of wine, has not an agreeable taste, but rather bitter, yet it is much used by these people for the good effects they find therein. In 1686, John Ray, 1628 through 1704, one of the most celebrated of English naturalists, published his Universal History of Plants, notable among other things for being the first work of its kind to extol the virtues of coffee in a scientific treatise. R. Bradley, professor of botany at Cambridge, published, 1714, a short historical account of coffee, all trace of which appears to be lost. Dr. James Douglas published in London, 1727, his Arbor Yemenis Fructum Coffee Ferens, or a description and history of the coffee tree, in which he laid under heavy contribution the Arabian and French writers that had preceded him. End of section 7.